Welcome to my channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. Before we begin tonight's story, do me a quick favor. Check your doors. Are they locked? Good. Now, check your windows. All of them. I'll wait. Have you ever had that feeling, that unmistakable sensation that you're not alone? That prickle on the back of your neck, the subtle shift in the air, the certainty that if you turned around quickly enough, you might catch something watching you? Well, this story might explain those feelings, or make them so much worse. If you're tucked in bed right now, you might want to check your closet one last time. Maybe glance under your bed, and whatever you do, don't look at your bedroom window after 3 a.m., because what I'm about to tell you happened to a real person in a real American city just like yours. This story has never been shared publicly before tonight, and I have to warn you, once you hear it, you might start noticing things. Small things at first, objects slightly out of place, strange sounds at exactly 3:17 a.m., your reflection taking just a fraction of a second too long to mirror your movements. If you're brave enough to continue, hit that like button right now and subscribe for more true American nightmares every week. And let me know in the comments if anything unusual happens after you listen to this story. And now, our story begins. The first time I noticed it was 3 weeks ago. A simple thing, really. The kitchen chair was pulled out from the table, just slightly, not enough to make you stop and stare, but enough that I paused for a moment before pushing it back in place. I'd been living alone in my Minneapolis apartment for 8 months since Jennifer left, and meticulous habits die hard. Each chair at perfect right angles to the Pottery Barn table, each Starbucks mug hanging on its designated hook. Getting sloppy, Mark, I muttered to myself. Nothing more. 2 days later, I came home from my shift at the hospital and found my dog-eared copy of Stephen King's The Shining open on the IKEA coffee table. Page 217. I was only on page 94. I closed the book, set it aside, and tried to recall if I'd flipped through it that morning while sipping my Dunkin' Donuts coffee. I hadn't. I was certain. I hadn't touched the book since the previous night. Sleep deprivation, I figured. I'd been working 12-hour shifts in the ER, trying to fill the Jennifer-shaped void with bandages and patient charts. The following week brought more oddities. A half-empty can of Diet Coke on my desk that I didn't remember opening. The shower running when I came home, just briefly before shutting off. The slight indentation on the left side of my Target brand mattress, the side where Jennifer used to sleep, when I was certain I'd made it perfectly that morning. I started keeping a journal. Not a Dear Diary sort of thing, just a log of these anomalies on my iPhone Notes app. Cataloging them made me feel less crazy somehow. It gave structure to the growing unease that had taken up residence in my chest. Tuesday, October 4th, 6:45 p.m. Found living room window open 2 inches, outside temperature 48 degrees, definitely closed before leaving for work. 9:32 p.m. Netflix suddenly switched to a documentary I've never watched. Remote was across the room. 11:07 p.m. Distinct smell of Jennifer's bath and body works lotion in hallway. Bottle has been gone since she left. "You look like hell, Mark," my colleague Tyrone said over lunch at Chipotle on Thursday. He wasn't wrong. Sleep had become elusive. I'd wake at 3:17 a.m., always exactly 3:17, feeling a presence in my apartment. Not threatening necessarily, but undeniably there. I'd stare into the darkness, imagining shapes where there should be none, holding my breath to better hear the sounds that seemed to hover just below audibility. "I think I need a vacation," I replied, pushing my untouched burrito bowl away. "Maybe drive up to Lake Superior for the weekend." "Or therapy," Tyrone said, only half joking. "Jennifer's been gone almost a year, man. Maybe it's time to talk to someone." I nodded, knowing he meant well, but also knowing this wasn't about Jennifer. Not directly, anyway. That night, I installed a Ring security camera in my living room. Nothing fancy, just a basic model that would record motion and upload to cloud storage. I told myself it was for peace of mind. If nothing showed up on the footage, I could finally accept that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown and seek help. The first night's footage showed nothing unusual. I watched the entire 8 hours at double speed while drinking my morning Folgers. Just an empty living room, occasional shadows cast by passing cars, the gentle flutter of curtains from the heating vent. The second night was the same, and the third. On the fourth night at 3:17 a.m., there was a momentary distortion in the footage. A few seconds of static, then normal recording resumed. I replayed those seconds multiple times, squinting at the screen of my Dell laptop. In the final frame before the static, I thought I saw something, a dark blur at the edge of the frame. After the static cleared, nothing was different in the room. I added 2 more cameras the next day, one in the hallway, one in my bedroom. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, observed, studied. At work, I found myself checking over my shoulder, startling at the slightest sound. My focus began to suffer. I gave a patient the wrong discharge instructions. I nearly administered the wrong medication dosage before a nurse caught my error. "Mark, take tomorrow off," my supervisor said after my third mistake of the shift. Not a suggestion. I didn't fight it. Instead, I went home and reviewed the previous night's footage. All 3 cameras showed the same distortion at 3:17 a.m. This time, I was ready. I extracted the frames before and after the static on each camera and enhanced them as best I could with my limited software. The living room camera showed that same dark blur, more distinct now. The hallway camera captured something more disturbing, a figure, humanoid but somehow wrong in proportion, standing motionless, facing my bedroom. The bedroom camera showed nothing unusual before the static, but after, my sleeping form had changed position. My arm, which had been draped across my chest, was now extended toward the empty side of the bed. Cold terror washed over me. I wasn't crazy. Something was in my apartment at night. Something was watching me sleep. I spent that night at a Super 8 motel, a cheap place off I-94 with buzzing fluorescent lights and sheets that smelled of industrial bleach. I slept fitfully, waking, of course, at 3:17 a.m. The motel room felt different from my apartment. Not safer, just observed in a different way. In the morning, I drove home with a new plan. I would set up a trap. Not something harmful, just a way to confirm what I was seeing. I scattered baby powder on the hardwood floor in the hallway and living room. I placed clear Scotch tape across doorways at ankle height. Not enough to trip someone, just enough to be disturbed by passing through. I positioned small objects, quarters, paper clips, buttons, in precise patterns that would be disrupted by movement. That night I took a Benadryl and set my iPhone to record audio all night. I needed to sleep, to be present in the apartment at 3:17 a.m., but I also needed evidence. The Benadryl worked too well. I woke groggy at 9:43 a.m., sunlight streaming through blinds I didn't remember opening. My phone was dead. The all-night recording had drained the battery. I plugged it into my Anchor charger with trembling hands and surveyed my traps. The baby powder was undisturbed. The Scotch tape across the doorways was intact. The small objects remained in their precise patterns. Relief flooded through me, followed almost immediately by doubt. Had I imagined everything? Was Tyrone right? Was this some delayed grief response to losing Jennifer? My phone chimed as it gained enough power to turn on. I waited impatiently for it to boot up, then checked the audio recording. 8 hours of silence, punctuated by my occasional sleep murmurs and the normal creaks of an apartment building at night. And then, at 3:17 a.m., a voice. Not mine.
Not anyone's, I recognized. He's becoming aware. Adjustment required. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It had a flat quality, like something approximating human speech without understanding inflection. I played it again, and again. Each time, the dread in my stomach grew heavier. He's becoming aware. Adjustment required. My hands shook as I checked the security cameras. All three showed the same thing. Static at exactly 3:17 a.m., lasting exactly 7 seconds. No visible disturbances before or after. I called in sick to work, then spent the day researching. I looked into sleep disorders, carbon monoxide poisoning, early onset schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, anything that might explain what was happening. I considered the possibility of a neighbor playing an elaborate prank, though I'd barely exchanged words with any of them in the months since moving in after the breakup. By evening, I had no answers, only a pounding headache and a growing certainty that I was not alone in my apartment. Not at 3:17 a.m. That night, I decided on a different approach. No Benadryl, no camera, no traps. Instead, I made a pot of Green Mountain coffee at 11 p.m. and settled into the lazy boy facing my bedroom door, a Louisville Slugger across my lap. I would be awake at 3:17 a.m. I would see with my own eyes what was happening. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. Then 1 a.m. My eyelids grew heavy despite the caffeine. At 2:30, I got up and splashed cold water on my face. At 3:10, I returned to the armchair, gripped tight on the baseball bat. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. At 3:15, I turned off the single lamp, plunging the apartment into darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, the familiar shapes of furniture emerging as gray outlines against deeper black. 3:16. 3:17. Nothing happened. No static, no distortion of reality, no presence. Just the ordinary night sounds of the building, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside, the distant thump of a neighbor's bass. I waited until 3:20, then exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Perhaps whatever it was knew I was watching. Perhaps it only appeared when I was asleep. Or perhaps, and this thought chilled me more than any presence could, I truly was losing my mind. I switched the lamp back on and returned to bed, exhausted beyond measure. Sleep came quickly, pulling me under into vivid, disjointed dreams. Jennifer was there, but her face kept changing, becoming something inhuman before shifting back. She spoke, but her voice was the flat voice from my recording. Adjustment required. I woke to sunlight and the harsh buzz of my alarm. 7:30 a.m. I had slept through the night after all. I reached for my phone to silence the alarm and found it wasn't there, not on the nightstand where I always kept it. I sat up, confused, and saw it on the dresser across the room. The screen was on, displaying a video player, my security app. With growing unease, I got up and took the phone. The video was cued to 3:17 a.m. I pressed play. The footage showed my bedroom, dimly lit by the light from the hallway. I could see myself sleeping, curled on my side. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a dark shape moved into the frame from the doorway. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, torso too narrow. It had a face, but the features seemed to shift and reform continuously, never settling into anything recognizable. It moved to my bedside with a strange, fluid grace. Then it bent down, its face hovering inches from mine. A slender arm extended, fingers elongating until they were more like tendrils than human digits. These tendrils hovered over my head, not quite touching. I dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the video still playing. I could hear the audio now, a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but too measured, too precise. I fled the apartment, not bothering to change out of my pajamas. I drove aimlessly for hours in my Honda Civic, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. By afternoon, reason began to reassert itself. The video could have been faked. I could have sleepwalked and planted it myself. Carbon monoxide could cause hallucinations and memory loss. I drove to Home Depot and bought a carbon monoxide detector. Then to Best Buy for more cameras, higher quality this time, with better night vision. Finally, I stopped at my doctor's office and begged for an emergency appointment. The receptionist, seeing my disheveled state, squeezed me in. Dr. Patel listened patiently as I described the past few weeks, careful to stick to observable facts and avoid wild speculations about what might be causing them. She ordered blood work, asked about my family history of mental illness, none, and gently suggested a referral to a psychiatrist. "Sleep disturbances can have many causes," she said, writing a prescription. "This will help you rest tonight. I don't think it's anything physical, Mark, but let's rule that out first. The blood work will tell us more." I nodded, grateful for her matter-of-fact approach. I didn't mention the video. Some rationality remained, and I knew how it would sound. That night, new carbon monoxide detector installed and beeping reassuringly with its all-clear status, new cameras hidden in less obvious locations, I took Dr. Patel's prescribed Ambien and went to bed early. I dreamed of Jennifer again. We were in our old apartment, the one we'd shared before the breakup. She was packing boxes, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have seen it," she said, her voice normal at first, but gradually flattening into that now familiar monotone. "Some things aren't meant to be observed." "What is it?" I asked. "What's happening to me?" She turned to face me, but her features were blurred, as if someone had taken an eraser to them. "Not to you," she said. "Through you." I woke with a gasp at 6:45 a.m. No 3:17 awakening. I felt more rested than I had in weeks. The apartment was quiet, normal. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting warm patterns on the hardwood floor. I reached for my phone, then hesitated. Did I want to know? If the cameras had captured something again, what would I do with that information? Who would believe me? In the end, curiosity won out. I checked the footage. Nothing. All 4 cameras showed an uneventful night. No static, no distortion, no tall figure with shifting features. The relief was so profound I nearly wept. Carbon monoxide poisoning, then, or some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. Either way, it was over. I would follow up with Dr. Patel, maybe take her suggestion about seeing a psychiatrist. I would move forward. I showered, dressed, and for the first time in weeks felt hungry for breakfast. I made Eggo waffles and Starbucks instant coffee, humming along to a Taylor Swift song playing in my head. As I was washing up afterward, my phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Mark Thompson?" A woman's voice, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes?" "This is Amanda from Dr. Patel's office. She asked me to call you. Your blood work came back with some unusual results. She'd like you to come in today if possible." My stomach tightened. "What kind of unusual results?" A pause. "I'm not authorized to discuss that, Mr. Thompson, but Dr. Patel has cleared her lunch hour to see you. 12:30? I agreed and hung up, appetite gone. What could be so unusual that Dr. Patel would clear her lunch hour? Cancer? Some rare disease? I tried to work from home, but concentration eluded me. At 12:15, I drove to Dr. Patel's office, arriving early. She kept me waiting only 5 minutes before calling me back. "Mark," she said, gesturing to a chair. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see tension around her eyes. "Thank you for coming in so quickly." "What is it?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "What did the blood work show?" She opened a folder on her desk, though I had the sense she didn't need to refer to it. "Your blood chemistry is anomalous." Several markers that should be present aren't. Others show values I've never seen before. She looked up at me. I sent your samples for further testing, but I wanted to see you in person. How are you feeling today? Better, I said cautiously. I slept through the night. No disturbances. She nodded. Good. That's good. She hesitated, then asked, Mark, have you experienced any lost time recently? Periods you can't account for? A chill ran through me. What do you mean? Gaps in memory. Hours or days where you're not sure what you did. I started to say no, then stopped. There had been moments, hadn't there? Days at work where I couldn't recall the commute. Evenings where I'd sat down to watch ESPN and suddenly it was hours later with no memory of what I'd seen. Maybe, I admitted. Why? Dr. Patel closed the folder. I'd like to refer you to a specialist, not a psychiatrist, she added, seeing my expression. A neurologist. Dr. Warner at Mayo Clinic is excellent, and he can see you tomorrow morning. You think there's something wrong with my brain? The words came out hollow. I think we need more information, she said carefully. The blood work could indicate several things. A metabolic disorder, an autoimmune response, or... She stopped. Or what? She met my eyes directly. Or something I've never seen before, and I'd rather not speculate until we have more data. I left her office with a referral to Dr. Warner and a prescription for Xanax. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I didn't check the security cameras. I didn't want to know. That night, I didn't take Dr. Patel's Ambien. I needed to be alert, aware. I set an alarm for 3:10 a.m. and tried to rest. The alarm woke me from a dreamless sleep. 3:10 a.m. I sat up in bed, fully clothed. I hadn't bothered changing, and waited. My bedroom door was open, offering a view of the hallway. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of electronics. 3:15 a.m. I felt it before I saw anything. A change in air pressure, subtle but unmistakable. The hairs on my arms rose. My breath fogged in front of me, though the apartment wasn't cold. 3:16 a.m. A flickering in my peripheral vision. I turned my head slowly, not wanting to startle whatever might be there. The corner of my bedroom seemed darker than it should be, the darkness more substantial somehow. 3:17 a.m. The darkness moved. It didn't spread or grow, it stepped forward, coalescing into that same tall figure I'd seen in the video. Its face was a blank oval, features forming and dissolving like clouds. It regarded me for a long moment, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't move. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from a physical inability. My muscles simply wouldn't respond to commands. The figure approached the bed with that same fluid grace. It extended an arm, too long, joints bending where joints shouldn't be, and reached toward my face. I tried to scream. No sound emerged. The fingers, or tendrils, or whatever they were, hovered inches from my forehead. Then, in that flat voice I'd heard on the recording, it spoke. Observation alters results. Subject has become aware of the study. Study? What study? As if hearing my thought, it continued. Replacement necessary. This vessel is compromised. Vessel? Did it mean me? The tendrils finally made contact with my skin. The sensation was neither hot nor cold, but something else entirely. A vibration that resonated through my skull and down my spine. Preparing extraction, it said. Replacement unit is ready. The vibration intensified. My vision blurred, darkened at the edges. I felt a pulling sensation, as if something essential was being drawn out through my forehead. With monumental effort, I managed to move one hand. I reached for the bedside lamp and knocked it to the floor. The crash seemed to startle the figure. Its tendrils withdrew momentarily. In that instant of distraction, I found my voice. "What are you?" The featureless face regarded me. Then slowly, features appeared. Eyes, nose, mouth. Not shifting now, but forming into a face I recognized. My face. "We are observers," it said. Its voice still flat, but now with an undertone that sounded eerily like my own. "Your kind is being studied. You were a good vessel, but now you are aware. This compromises data." "I don't understand," I managed, though the pulling sensation had resumed, weaker now, but still present. "You are not meant to." A pause. "Original consciousness will be preserved in the collective. A new consciousness will inhabit this form. The study will continue." The pulling intensified again. My vision tunneled. The last thing I saw was my own face looking down at me, features settling into a perfect replica, eyes empty of anything I would recognize as human. Then darkness. I wake to sunlight and the harsh buzz of my alarm. 7:30 a.m. I've slept through the night, it seems. I reach for my iPhone to silence the alarm and find it on the nightstand where I always keep it. The apartment feels different this morning. Cleaner, somehow. More orderly. I shower and dress for work, noting with approval how neatly my clothes are arranged in the closet. I make breakfast, Eggo waffles and Starbucks instant coffee, and wash up immediately afterward. As I'm about to leave, I notice a sealed envelope on the counter. Inside is a doctor's appointment card for a Dr. Warner, neurologist, at 10 a.m. I don't recall making this appointment. I should cancel it. I have a patient meeting at 11, and I'm behind on my charts. I drop the card into the trash and head for the door. As I'm leaving, I catch a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. For a moment, something about my reflection seems wrong. The eyes too flat, the smile too practiced. Then the moment passes, and it's just me, Mark Thompson, heading to work on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday. Everything is fine. Everything is as it should be. I close the door behind me at precisely 8:17 a.m. No one is watching. Not anymore. So next time you wake up at 3:17 a.m. with that feeling of being watched, next time you find something slightly out of place in your home, next time you catch your reflection looking just a bit off, remember this story. And remember, if you ever hear a voice say, "Adjustment required," it's already too late. Before you close this video, I need you to check something. Go look in a mirror right now. Do your eyes look the same as they always have? Are you certain that's really you looking back? The observers are everywhere, and they could be watching through anyone, even someone you trust. If this story kept you up tonight, smash that like button and hit subscribe. It helps the algorithm know you want more stories like this one. Share this with your friends who've ever complained about things moving in their homes. I read every comment, so tell me about the strangest, unexplained experience you've ever had in your house. Was it at 3:17 a.m.? Have you ever felt watched while completely alone? Next week's story features a forgotten tunnel system beneath a suburban Milwaukee neighborhood, and the people who disappeared exploring it. You do not want to miss this one. Sleep tight, America. Check your security cameras. And remember, sometimes the watcher and the watched are the same person. Whispered, but which one are you? Story number 2.
Hey there, fellow night owls and thrill seekers. Before I dive into what happened to me last October in the forests of Vermont, I need you to know something. The scratching I hear at night hasn't stopped, and I'm starting to think sharing this story might be the only thing keeping it at bay. If you're listening to this in bed, you might want to check that your feet are safely tucked under your blankets, and maybe double-check that your closet door is fully closed. I certainly wish I had. The doctors tell me there's nothing wrong with me. No hallucinations, no schizophrenia, nothing they can diagnose with their tests and brain scans. Just stress and post-traumatic anxiety. But they don't see what I see in the corner of my bedroom at 3:33 every morning. They don't hear what I hear when the apartment goes quiet. If my story resonates with you, or if you've experienced something similar in those quiet, forgotten corners of America's wilderness, let me know in the comments. Your stories might help me understand what's happening to me, and maybe help you prepare in case it's contagious. Our story begins now. It started with a camping trip that was supposed to help clear my head. My tech startup in Boston had just failed spectacularly. 3 years of work and $1.2 million in investor money down the drain. My girlfriend Melissa had moved out the weekend after the company folded, taking our dog Baxter with her. "I can't handle your mood swings anymore," she'd said, stuffing clothes into a suitcase. "It's like living with a ghost." My therapist, Dr. Winters, suggested forest bathing might help with my anxiety. "Just you and nature, Jake," she'd said, her voice calm and practiced. "No screens, no distractions. The Japanese call it Shinrin-yoku. It's been proven to lower cortisol levels." I remember laughing bitterly at the term, forest bathing. Like the trees could somehow wash away the mess I'd made of my life. Like standing among pines could erase the sight of my employees' faces when I told them we were shutting down. 23 people suddenly without jobs because I'd miscalculated everything. So I packed my Honda CR-V with a tent, sleeping bag, and enough supplies for a weekend at Green Mountain National Forest. The drive from Boston took about 3 hours, my playlist of 90s grunge providing the soundtrack to the changing landscape outside my window. Cities gave way to suburbs, suburbs to rolling farmland, and finally to the dense, ancient-looking forests of Vermont. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The October air had that specific crispness that belongs only to New England in fall. The kind that makes your lungs feel clean when you breathe it in. I chose a campsite away from the designated camping areas. Something in me needed true isolation, not the curated wilderness experience with other weekend warriors nearby. I wanted to feel small and insignificant against the vastness of nature. I wanted to remember that my problems were temporary blips in the grand scheme of things. I drove my car as far as the dirt road would take me, then hiked another mile into the woods, following what looked like an old game trail. The park map showed nothing in this area, just an empty green space marked Conservation Area. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. That empty space on the map wasn't just undeveloped land. It was deliberately left unmarked. Setting up camp was simple enough. I pitched my tent near a small clearing, surrounded by maple trees with leaves the color of fire. The forest floor was a mosaic of red and gold, beautiful in that melancholy way that autumn always is, a celebration of endings. As I hammered the last stake into the ground, I noticed something odd. A circle of stones near the edge of the clearing. They were arranged too precisely to be natural, each about the size of a softball, forming a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. In the center was a larger, flat stone that looked almost like an altar. I assumed it was something left by previous campers, though it looked old, very old. The stones were covered in lichen and half buried in the soil, as if they'd been there for decades, maybe centuries. I should have moved my tent then, should have found another spot. But the sun was setting, and I was tired, and what harm could some old stones do? Night falls quickly in the forest. One moment, dappled sunlight was filtering through the trees, and the next, I was fumbling with my headlamp as darkness pooled around me. I got a small fire going and sat beside it, watching the flames dance as I ate a dinner of instant ramen and beef jerky, very gourmet. The silence was absolute. No distant traffic, no hum of electronics. Just the occasional pop from the fire and the soft whisper of leaves rustling in the breeze. I should have found it peaceful. Instead, I felt watched. You know that sensation? When the skin between your shoulder blades starts to tingle? When your subconscious picks up on something your conscious mind hasn't processed yet? I kept turning to look behind me, only to find nothing there. Just trees and shadows, shifting slightly in the firelight. I told myself it was just city boy nerves, that I wasn't used to real silence anymore. I tried to focus on the stars instead. They were brilliant out there, away from city lights. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled sugar. That's when I first heard it. A sound like dry twigs snapping, just beyond the ring of firelight. Then silence. "Hello?" I called out, feeling immediately foolish. "Anyone there?" No response. Just the soft crackle of my dying fire. I added another log, watching the sparks spiral upward. Told myself it was probably just a deer or some other woodland creature. Nothing to worry about. The sound came again. Closer this time. Snap, snap, snap. Like footsteps. Deliberate, rhythmic. I stood up, heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. My voice sounded thin and insignificant against the vast darkness of the forest. The footsteps stopped, and then something shifted in the quality of the silence. It became anticipatory, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "This is private property," I lied, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice. "I have bear spray and I'm not afraid to use it." Another lie. The bear spray was sitting uselessly in my glove compartment, where I'd absent-mindedly left it. A low sound came from the darkness then. Not quite a growl, not quite a chuckle. Something in between. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up. I scrambled for my phone, forgetting momentarily that there was no service out here. The screen's blue glow was reassuring anyway, a small piece of the civilized world I'd left behind. 3:33 a.m. Wait, that couldn't be right. I'd only finished setting up camp around 6 p.m. Had I fallen asleep by the fire? I didn't remember dozing off. The fire had burned down to embers, which suggested time had indeed passed. But 9 hours? That made no sense. That's when I noticed the smell, like wet earth and something metallic, something like old pennies or blood. It seemed to be coming from my tent. I raised my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the small dome tent. From the outside, everything looked normal. The rain fly was secure, the zippers closed just as I'd left them. But something moved inside, a shadow passing across the thin fabric of the tent wall. My breath caught in my throat. Someone, or something, was in my tent. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. It could be a raccoon or squirrel that had found its way inside searching for food. But another part of me, some primitive instinct buried beneath layers of civilization and technology, recognized this as something else, something wrong. I backed away slowly, my feet crunching on fallen leaves. Each step felt like an alarm bell in the quiet forest. The movement inside the tent stopped. Whatever was in there had heard me. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. We were at an impasse, me frozen in fear, and the thing in my tent waiting. Then the zipper of the tent door began to move. Slowly, deliberately, from the inside. I didn't wait to see what emerged. I turned and ran, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my face. My only thought was to reach my car, parked about half a mile down a dirt road. I ran blindly, the beam of my phone's flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. The forest seemed to close in, branches reaching like grasping hands. More than once I stumbled, my feet catching on exposed roots or unseen obstacles. Behind me, I heard movement. Fast, gaining. My lungs burned, my legs ached. But fear pushed me forward, even as part of me recognized I was running in the wrong direction. The dirt road should have appeared by now. Instead, the forest was becoming denser, older. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than any I'd seen before. Their branches twisted overhead, blocking out the stars. It was as if I'd stumbled into some ancient part of the forest that wasn't on any map. I stopped, gasping for breath, and spun in a circle, the light from my phone carving a desperate arc through the darkness. Trees. Just trees in every direction. And silence, no footsteps, no pursuit. Had I imagined it all? Was I having some kind of breakdown? I leaned against a tree trunk, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think logically. I needed to find north. My car was northeast of my campsite. If I could just orient myself. That's when my phone died. The screen went black with a sad little chime, plunging me into absolute darkness. I bit back a scream, stood perfectly still, waiting for my eyes to adjust.
Slowly, shapes emerged from the blackness. The hulking silhouettes of trees, a faint path through the underbrush, and moonlight, thank God for moonlight, filtering through in patches where the canopy thinned. I decided to follow the path. It had to lead somewhere, and anywhere was better than standing still, waiting for whatever had been in my tent. The path twisted through the ancient trees, sometimes so faint I feared I'd lost it. But I pressed on, one careful step at a time. That's when I started to notice the carvings. At first I thought they were just unusual patterns in the bark, but as my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, I could see they were deliberate. Symbols etched into the trunks of the oldest trees. Spirals, eye-like shapes, things that might have been letters in some alphabet I didn't recognize. I reached out to touch one, my fingertips tracing the grooves in the bark. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice came from behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I whirled around to find an old man standing there, a lantern held aloft in one gnarled hand. He wore what looked like a park ranger's uniform, though it seemed old-fashioned somehow, the green fabric faded and worn. His badge was tarnished brass, not the shiny plastic I'd seen on rangers at the visitor center. "Those ain't for touching," he said, nodding toward the carved symbols. "They mark the boundary." "Boundary?" My voice came out as a croak. "Boundary of what?" The old man's face was deeply lined, his eyes pale in the lantern light. They were an unsettling color, not quite blue, not quite gray, but something in between, like the sky before a devastating storm. A thin scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, puckered and white against his weather-beaten skin. "Between what's ours and what's theirs." His voice had a peculiar quality to it. A Vermont accent, yes, but with something else underneath, something older. The cadence reminded me of recordings I'd heard of Appalachian mountain folk from the early 20th century. "I don't understand," I said, glancing back at the carved symbols. In the lantern light, they seemed to shift and change, as if the shadows themselves were alive. One symbol that had looked like a spiral now resembled an eye. Another that had been a series of concentric circles now looked distinctly like a face with too many eyes and no mouth. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the October night. "I'm lost," I said. "I was camping and I need to get back to my car." He studied me for a long moment. "You crossed over," he finally said. "Not many do that these days. Folks mostly stick to the designated areas with their fancy GPS and trail maps." He spat on the ground. "Safer that way." "Crossed over what?" I asked, although part of me didn't want to know the answer. "The old lines," he said, as if that explained everything. "Come on, I'll take you back. But we gotta be quick about it. It's found your scent now." "What has?" He didn't answer, just turned and started walking, the circle of lantern light bobbing ahead of him. I followed, having little choice. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The old man moved with surprising speed, navigating the forest with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime there. "What's your name?" I finally asked, just to break the silence. "Don't matter," he said without looking back. "Names have power out here. Best not to spread 'em around." Another chill went through me. "What was in my tent?" I asked. He stopped so abruptly I nearly ran into him. "You saw it?" No, I admitted. But something was in there. Something that wasn't natural. He nodded slowly. They get curious sometimes. About us. About our world. Usually they just watch from a distance. But sometimes... He trailed off, looking into the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. Sometimes they take an interest in particular people. Why? Who knows why they do anything? He shrugged. Maybe you've got something they want. Maybe you remind them of something they've lost. Or maybe you just happen to camp on a spot where the veil is thin. The veil? Between worlds, he said, as if it were obvious. This forest sits on a seam. Most folks can't see it, can't feel it, but it's there. Has been since before the first Europeans came. The native tribes knew about it. They left offerings at the old stones. I wanted to dismiss it all as the ramblings of a crazy old man, but after what I'd experienced, I wasn't in a position to be skeptical. How do I get rid of it? I asked. The thing that was in my tent? His pale eyes fixed on mine. You don't, he said flatly. Once they take an interest, that's it. You're marked. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? What will it do to me? Depends on what kind you encountered, he said. Some just want to observe. They'll watch you from shadows, from reflections. Follow you home. Stand over your bed at night. I thought of the scratching sounds I'd been hearing. The feeling of being watched that had persisted even after I returned to Boston. Others are more interactive, he continued. They might move things around in your house, leave little gifts, try to communicate. And the dangerous ones? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. A shadow passed over his face. You'd know by now if you'd met one of those. They don't waste time. They take what they want and leave the husk behind. The husk? My mouth went dry. The old man nodded solemnly. Had a group of college kids come through here in '87. 5 of them went in. 4 came out, but one of those 4 wasn't right. Talked like her friend, walked like her friend, but anyone who knew her could tell it wasn't her anymore. Her eyes were all wrong. Empty. What happened to her? I whispered. Official report said she had a psychotic break, committed herself to Butler Hospital down in Providence. Last I heard, she was still there. Hasn't spoken a word in 37 years. I swallowed hard. How do I know which kind is following me? The old man stopped walking and turned to face me. His pale eyes seemed to look through me rather than at me. You watch for the signs. If it wanted you dead, you'd be dead. If it wanted your body, it would have taken it by now. So what does it want? He shrugged. Maybe it's lonely. Maybe it's curious. Maybe you reminded of someone it used to know. From before. Before what? But he just shook his head and kept walking. We walked on, the forest gradually thinning, becoming more like the typical New England woodland I was familiar with. Younger trees, less undergrowth. The carved symbols on the trees became less frequent, then stopped altogether. And then, suddenly, we were at a dirt road. My dirt road. I could see my Honda parked about 50 yards away, exactly where I'd left it. The sight of something so ordinary, so connected to my regular life, made me dizzy with relief. Relief flooded through me. Thank you, I said, turning to the old man. I don't know what I would have done if... But he was gone. The space where he had stood was empty, not even footprints in the soft earth to show he'd been there at all. I told myself he must have slipped away while I was distracted by the sight of my car. That there was a rational explanation for everything that had happened. Sleep deprivation, anxiety. Maybe I'd even accidentally eaten some hallucinogenic mushrooms. The drive back to Boston was uneventful. Dawn broke as I crossed into Massachusetts, the rising sun transforming the world into something normal and comprehensible again. By the time I reached my apartment in Somerville, the events in the forest had taken on a dreamlike quality. But that night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it for the first time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Like fingernails on wood coming from inside my closet. I bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp on my bedside table. The sound stopped immediately. Heart racing, I got out of bed and approached the closet. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. In that moment, I thought about all the horror movies I'd seen where the protagonist opens the door they absolutely shouldn't open. I almost turned around, almost went back to bed and pulled the covers over my head. But I needed to know. I opened the door slowly, half expecting. Well, I don't know what I was expecting. A creature with too many limbs crouched among my shirts? A tall, thin figure with a face that wasn't quite a face? Nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly, shoes lined up on the floor, my winter coats pushed to one side, the box of Christmas decorations on the shelf above. But as I went to close the door, I noticed something. 3 thin lines on the inside of the door, about halfway up. They looked like scratches, as if someone, or something, had run their fingernails down the wood. I touched them gently. They were fresh, the wood still slightly splintered. I closed the door, telling myself it was just the building settling. My apartment was in an old Victorian house, divided into units. Creaky floors and strange noises came with the territory. The scratches were probably there all along. I just hadn't noticed them before. But the scratching came again the next night, and the next, always from the closet, always stopping the moment I turned on a light. And each time I checked, there were more scratches on the inside of the door. Sometimes arranged in patterns that almost looked like letters or symbols, sometimes clustered together like a child's angry scribbles. Then I started noticing other things. Small objects moving from where I'd left them. Keys that had been on the kitchen counter appearing in the bathroom sink. My coffee mug turning up in the refrigerator. I installed a security camera in my living room. The footage showed nothing unusual, except for one night when the camera mysteriously rotated 180 degrees between 3:32 and 3:34 a.m. The timestamp jumped, as if someone had edited out the intervening seconds. I started seeing a new therapist. Told her about my anxiety, my failed business, my breakup, but not about what happened in Vermont, not about the scratching or the moving objects. I knew how that would sound. She prescribed anti-anxiety medication, little blue pills that made the world feel slightly out of focus. It helped me sleep through the night, but I still sometimes woke to find things rearranged. A book that had been on my nightstand now splayed open on the floor. My laptop moved from the desk to the bed. My coffee mug filled with small, smooth stones I'd never seen before. I installed a carbon monoxide detector, thinking maybe that was the cause of my experiences. It never went off. I had an electrician check the wiring, wondering if electromagnetic fields could cause hallucinations. He said everything was normal. I even contacted my ex-girlfriend, Melissa, asking if she'd been coming by the apartment, maybe using her old key. The conversation didn't go well. "Are you serious, Jake?" she'd said, her voice tight with anger. "You think I'm breaking into your place and, what, moving your stuff around? Why would I do that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I just can't explain what's happening." "What's happening is that you're having a breakdown," she said. "Get help. Real help." But even the real help couldn't explain why my bathroom mirror fogged up every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., even though the shower hadn't been used for hours. Or why my phone's battery would suddenly drain from full to empty without any apps running. Or why my houseplants kept dying, their leaves curling and blackening overnight as if touched by frost, even in the warm apartment. And sometimes, in the moment between sleep and wakefulness, I catch a glimpse of something standing in the corner of my bedroom. A darker patch of darkness, roughly human-shaped, but wrong somehow, too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly but unnervingly off, its limbs too long and jointed in places human limbs shouldn't joint. its head slightly too large and oddly shaped, like a mushroom cap. I never see it directly. It's always in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turn to look at it head-on. But I feel its presence, a heaviness in the air, a sense of being observed by something ancient and patient and utterly alien. I've tried everything: salt across the thresholds, iron nails above the doors. Even had a Wiccan friend come over to cleanse the apartment with sage smoke. I found a specialist in Boston who deals with supernatural phenomena, a middle-aged woman with too many cats and a living room full of crystals. She performed what she called a banishing ritual that involved chicken blood and Latin incantations. Nothing works. If anything, the activity has increased, as if my attempts to get rid of it have only made it more determined to make its presence known. The old man in the forest was right. I'm marked now. But lately I've started to wonder if there's another possibility. What if it's not malevolent? What if it's just curious, trying in its own incomprehensible way to communicate? Last week I found a small, perfect acorn on my pillow when I came home from work. I know for a fact it wasn't there when I made the bed that morning, and acorns don't grow anywhere near my apartment building. It was from the forest. My forest visitor had brought me a gift. I studied that acorn for hours. It looked ordinary enough, brown and glossy with its little cap still attached. But when I held it, it felt significant somehow, like it contained some message I couldn't quite decipher. That night, I dreamt of an oak tree growing in the middle of my apartment, its branches pushing through the ceiling, its roots breaking through the floor. In the dream, the tree was ancient, its trunk wider than my car, and carved into its bark were the same symbols I'd seen in the forest. I woke up with tears on my face, though I couldn't tell you why. So now I've started leaving things out for it. A shiny quarter, a smooth river stone I've had since childhood, a piece of dark chocolate, a feather I found in the park, a small sketch I made of the forest.
They always disappear during the night, and the scratching has become less frequent. Instead, I find other things. A perfect maple leaf, even though it's now December and all the trees are bare. A bird's feather, iridescent blue-black, from a species I can't identify. A small, intricate arrangement of twigs on my kitchen table that looks almost like a model of a solar system. Once, I found my bathroom mirror covered in symbols drawn in what looked like mud, the same symbols from the trees. I took photos before washing them away. I've shown them to linguists, to anthropologists, even to a cryptographer I found online. No one recognizes them. They're not any known human language, the cryptographer told me. The patterns have a structure that suggests meaning, but it's not like anything I've ever seen. I still feel watched. Still sometimes catch movement in my peripheral vision. Still find things moved from where I left them. But I'm no longer afraid. Not exactly, more intrigued. What does it want from me? Why me? What is it trying to say? Last night, for the first time, I spoke to it directly. I stood in the center of my living room at midnight and said, "I know you're here. I know you've been following me since the forest. What do you want from me?" The lights flickered briefly. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in the air. And then, for just a moment, I saw it clearly. A tall, slender silhouette against the wall. Not a shadow, exactly, but something darker than shadow. Something that seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. It raised what might have been an arm, pointed at me with what might have been a finger, and then it was gone. The room warmed up again. The lights stabilized, but on my phone, which had been sitting on the coffee table, I found a new note, just 3 words typed in my own notes app. Not alone anymore. If anyone listening has experienced something similar, please let me know in the comments. Maybe together we can figure this out. Until then, I'll keep leaving my little offerings. Keep listening for messages in the scratching code against my closet door. Keep watching for glimpses of my visitor from the forest. Just, if you decide to go camping, stick to the designated areas. Check for carved symbols on the trees, and if you feel watched, you probably are. Oh, and one last thing. Since I started telling this story, sharing it with others, the scratching has stopped completely. For the first time in months, my apartment feels empty when I'm alone. So maybe that's the key, spreading the story, sharing the experience. Or maybe I've just passed it on to you. Listen carefully tonight. That sound you hear might not be the house settling or the pipes groaning. It might be fingernails on wood. It might be something that followed me home from the forest, now finding its way to you. Sleep tight, and maybe check your closet before you turn out the lights.
Story number 3. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, completely alert, yet unable to move a single muscle? That terrifying moment when your mind is screaming at your body to react, but nothing happens? Now imagine seeing something standing at the foot of your bed during those paralyzing moments. Something that shouldn't be there. Something watching you. That's exactly what happened to me last October in my ordinary suburban home in Maple Creek, Wisconsin. What I experienced that night changed everything I thought I knew about reality, about the thin veil between our world and whatever lies beyond. I'm sharing my story now because I need to know if anyone else has seen what I've seen. If you have, please leave a comment below. If this is your first time hearing about something like this, subscribe now, because there's so much more to this mystery than I initially realized. This is my story. The story begins. I'd always been a light sleeper. The tiniest noises would wake me. A car door slamming down the street, the hum of the refrigerator kicking on, even my cat Luna padding across the hardwood floors. My ex used to joke that I had bat ears, which wasn't entirely a compliment when I'd wake him up because I heard something strange at 3 a.m. So when I moved into my own place after the breakup, I thought the undisturbed silence would be blissful. Just me and Luna in a charming 2-bedroom Craftsman built in the 1930s. The rent was suspiciously affordable for Maple Creek, where housing prices had skyrocketed in recent years, but I didn't question my good fortune. The elderly owner, Mrs. Abernathy, had seemed eager to find a tenant quickly after the last one moved out unexpectedly. "It's such a cozy home," she'd said, her thin fingers turning the tarnished key over to me. "Perfect for someone who appreciates character." The way she hesitated made me curious, but I was too relieved at finding a place within my budget to press for details. Besides, the house was beautiful. Original hardwood floors, crown molding, a breakfast nook with a stained glass window that cast rainbow patterns across the kitchen table each morning. What wasn't to love? For the first 2 weeks, everything was perfect. I settled into a comfortable routine, arranging my modest furniture in the space and hanging my collection of vintage botanical prints on the walls. Luna adjusted quickly too, finding her favorite sunbeams and claiming the window seat in the living room as her personal domain. Then October arrived, bringing with it unusually cold weather and early sunsets. The maple trees that gave our town its name blazed with fiery colors before shedding their leaves in rustling cascades. I'd always loved fall, but something about this particular autumn felt different, heavier somehow. Like the thinning veil between seasons wasn't the only boundary growing weaker. It started with small things. Keys that weren't where I'd left them. A coffee mug on the counter when I was certain I'd put it in the dishwasher. Luna staring intently at empty corners, her tail puffed to twice its size. "There's nothing there, silly girl," I'd tell her. But sometimes I'd catch myself avoiding those same corners after dark. Then came the dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams of walking through my own house, except everything was slightly wrong. Doorways led to unfamiliar rooms. Windows showed landscapes that couldn't possibly exist in Wisconsin. And always, there was the sense that someone was following just behind me,
breathing softly on the nape of my neck. I'd wake gasping, heart racing, then convince myself it was just stress from my new job at the local library. Working with the public could be draining, and I was still adjusting to the change. But on that night, October 27th, I couldn't explain away what happened. I went to bed around 11 p.m., earlier than usual for a Thursday. I'd been feeling run down all week, fighting what I thought was a cold. Luna curled up at my feet, a warm, comforting presence as I drifted off to sleep. At exactly 3:14 a.m., my eyes snapped open. I know the precise time because the vintage alarm clock on my nightstand glowed an eerie red in the darkness. 3:14. The air in my bedroom felt different, heavier, colder, as if all the oxygen had been replaced with something thicker. And there was a smell, like damp soil and something metallic, like pennies and rain. I tried to sit up, to reach for the lamp on my nightstand, but my body wouldn't respond. Not a finger, not a toe, nothing. Panic flared as I realized I was completely paralyzed, trapped in my own body. My breath came in shallow gasps. Was I having a stroke? A heart attack? My mind raced through terrifying medical scenarios, each worse than the last. Then I felt it, the weight. Something was pressing down on the mattress at the foot of my bed. Luna was no longer at my feet. The pressure moved slightly, like someone or something shifting its weight. With enormous effort, I managed to move only my eyes, dragging my gaze from the clock toward the foot of my bed. There was a figure standing there, a silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness. It was tall and thin, almost impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso. I couldn't make out any features, just an outline that somehow absorbed what little light there was in the room. As I stared, frozen in terror, it began to move. Not toward me, thankfully, but around the perimeter of my bed, gliding with a strange, fluid motion, as if its feet weren't quite touching the ground. This isn't real, I tried to tell myself. Sleep paralysis. That's all this is. A hallucination caused by your brain waking before your body. I'd read about sleep paralysis before. The inability to move, the sense of a malevolent presence, even visual and auditory hallucinations, all documented symptoms of a phenomenon that, while terrifying, had scientific explanations. But as the figure drifted closer to the side of my bed, those rational thoughts provided little comfort. Because scientific explanations didn't account for what happened next. The shape leaned over me. I could feel cold radiating from it, like standing before an open freezer. Then it spoke. Not aloud, but directly into my mind. "Finally awake," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "I've been waiting for you to see me." I wanted to scream. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were as frozen as the rest of me. "Don't be afraid," it continued, though nothing about its presence was remotely comforting. "I lived here once, too." The entity, ghost, hallucination, whatever it was, reached out one long, spindly arm. I watched in horror as its hand approached my face. Its fingers were unnaturally elongated, ending in what looked like sharp points rather than fingertips. Just before it touched me, Luna leapt onto the bed with a furious hiss, placing herself between me and the figure. The shadow jerked back, seeming surprised. Can shadows feel surprise? And in that moment, I felt the paralysis begin to lift. First my fingers tingled, then my hands. The sensation rushed through my limbs like television static. With a gasping cry, I lunged for the lamp and switched it on. Golden light flooded the room, chasing shadows into corners. Luna stood at attention on my chest, fur bristling, staring at nothing. The figure was gone. I sat there trembling, clutching Luna to me until dawn broke through the curtains. Only then did I dare turn off the lamp and slide out of bed on shaky legs. Just sleep paralysis, I murmured to myself as I made coffee, extra strong that morning. A common experience,
Nothing supernatural. But if that was true, why had Luna reacted? And why did I find small, sooty footprints on the hardwood floor beside my bed? Footprints much too small to be mine and definitely not made by cat paws. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps I'd tracked in some dirt the day before and hadn't noticed. Maybe Luna had batted around a piece of charcoal from the fireplace that I thought I'd cleaned thoroughly. I went to work that day in a fog, shelving books in the wrong sections and jumping at the slightest sounds. My coworker, Tara, noticed my distraction. "Rough night?" she asked, her dark eyes concerned behind vintage cat-eye glasses. "Something like that," I replied, not ready to share my experience, even with Tara, who collected ghost stories and had a small tattoo of a Ouija board planchette on her wrist. "Well, you picked the right time of year for it," she said with a knowing smile. "The veil is thinning. Halloween's just around the corner." I forced a laugh. I don't think my insomnia got the Halloween memo. "Maybe it wasn't insomnia." Tara lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Did you know your house is one of the oldest in Maple Creek? It was built by Josiah Fleming, who made his fortune in the lumber industry. They say his business practices weren't exactly ethical." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say some of his competitors met with unfortunate accidents. Nothing was ever proven, of course." She shrugged. "But people talk, especially in small towns like ours." I tried to dismiss Tara's stories as local folklore, the kind every small town accumulates over decades. But that night I found myself researching Josiah Fleming online, scanning digitized newspaper archives from the early 1900s. There wasn't much. A few mentions of business dealings, a grainy photograph of a stern-faced man with hollow cheeks and piercing eyes standing in front of a lumber mill. Nothing about mysterious deaths or unethical practices. I was about to close my laptop when a headline from 1932 caught my eye. "Tragedy strikes Fleming household."
The article was brief, describing how Josiah's only daughter, Eleanor, had died unexpectedly in her sleep at the age of 27. The cause was listed as natural causes, though no specific illness was mentioned. Eleanor had been engaged to be married the following spring. There was a photograph accompanying the article. Eleanor in a white dress, her hair styled in the fashion of the era. She was smiling slightly, as if sharing a secret with the photographer. Something about her eyes struck me as familiar, though I couldn't place why. I closed my laptop and tried to put Eleanor Fleming out of my mind as I prepared for bed. I wasn't normally superstitious, but I left more lights on than usual and made sure Luna was in the bedroom with me before I reluctantly turned off the lamp. Sleep came fitfully, and I woke several times, convinced I'd heard footsteps or whispers. But each time I opened my eyes, the room was still and silent, with only the red glow of the alarm clock numbers changing slowly through the night. At 3:14 a.m., I woke again, the same time as the night before. This time, however, I could move. I sat up quickly, heart pounding, and scanned the room. No shadowy figures, no pressure on the bed. Luna was curled peacefully at my feet. Relief washed over me, followed almost immediately by doubt. Had I imagined the entire episode the previous night? Maybe it had been a particularly vivid nightmare, or a one-time sleep paralysis event triggered by stress. I was about to lie back down when I noticed something on my nightstand that hadn't been there when I went to bed, a small, tarnished silver locket. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. The metal was ice cold to the touch, as if it had been left outside in winter rather than in my warm bedroom. I hesitated before opening it, some instinct warning me against seeing what was inside. But curiosity overrode caution. The locket contained a tiny photograph, faded with age but still discernible. A young woman with a slight smile and familiar eyes. Eleanor Fleming. The locket slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering on the hardwood floor. Luna woke with a startled meow, jumping down to investigate the noise. "No, Luna, don't," I began, but it was too late.
She batted at the locket, sending it skittering under the bed. I should have left it there. I should have packed a bag right then and checked into a hotel until I could find a new place to live. Instead, I got down on my hands and knees, peering under the bed frame with my phone's flashlight. The beam illuminated the locket, which had come to rest against the baseboard. But that wasn't all I saw. Written in what looked like soot or ash on the underside of my bed frame were 3 words: "Not natural causes." I scrambled backward, banging my head on the nightstand in my haste to get away from whatever message had been left for me. Because it had been left for me. I was certain of that now. Whoever was in my house wanted to communicate. The question was, did I want to hear what they had to say? Dawn found me huddled on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, waiting for a reasonable hour to call Tara. Luna sat in the window, watching the street as the neighborhood slowly came to life. Normal, everyday life continuing just outside, while inside, my reality had shifted on its axis. At 8 a.m., I called Tara. "I need to know everything about Eleanor Fleming," I said without preamble when she answered. "Good morning to you too," she replied, yawning. "What's this about Eleanor? Please, Tara, it's important." She must have heard the desperation in my voice because her tone changed immediately. "Meet me at Percolate in 30 minutes, she said, naming a coffee shop near the library. 35 minutes later, we sat at a corner table, mugs of steaming coffee between us. I'd brought the locket in a small Ziploc bag, reluctant to touch it again, but knowing Tara would want to see it. "So you found this in your house?" she asked, examining the locket through the plastic. "And you're sure it wasn't there before?" "Positive," I said. "And there's more." I told her about the shadow figure, the sleep paralysis, the message under my bed. To her credit, Tara didn't look skeptical. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as I spoke. "The official story is that Eleanor died of pneumonia," she said when I finished. "But there have always been rumors. She was engaged to a man her father didn't approve of, Thomas Reynolds, son of Josiah's main business rival. Some people said Josiah would rather see his daughter dead than married to a Reynolds." "You think her father killed her?" The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Tara shrugged. "It's just town gossip from nearly a century ago, but—" She hesitated. "What?" "Eleanor's not the only young woman to die in that house. In the 1970s, a college student named Marissa Green was renting the place. She was found dead in her bed. Cause of death was ruled sudden cardiac arrest, despite her being only 22 and in perfect health." A chill ran through me. "And more recently?" "The tenant before you was a woman about your age, Ashley something. She didn't die, but she moved out suddenly after only 3 months, breaking her lease. Left most of her furniture behind. Mrs. Abernathy was pretty upset about it." I remembered Mrs. Abernathy's eagerness to rent the place quickly. Had she known something wasn't right with the house? Had she deliberately withheld information? "I can't stay there," I said flatly. "You could come stay with me for a few days," Tara offered. "Give yourself time to figure things out." I nodded gratefully, though I knew a few days wouldn't be enough. I couldn't imagine ever feeling safe in that house again. That afternoon, I packed enough clothes for a week and gathered Luna's supplies. As I was zipping my suitcase, I noticed a faint, musty smell, that same scent of damp soil and metal that I'd noticed during the sleep paralysis episode. The temperature in the bedroom plummeted suddenly. My breath fogged in front of me, and goosebumps erupted along my arms. "I'm leaving," I said aloud, addressing the empty room. No, not empty. Never empty. "I won't be back." A soft sound came from behind me, a sigh, perhaps, or a whisper. I turned slowly. There was no shadowy figure this time, but a young woman stood by the window, translucent in the afternoon light. Eleanor Fleming, wearing the same white dress from her photograph, her form flickering like a candle flame in a draft. I should have been terrified, but somehow seeing her clearly was less frightening than the shadow form she'd taken before. Her eyes held sorrow rather than malice. "Help me," she mouthed, no sound emerging from her pale lips. "How?" I whispered. "What do you want?" She raised one diaphanous hand, pointing not at me but past me toward the closet. Then she was gone, like mist dissipating in sunlight. I stood frozen for several moments, weighing my options. I could leave right now, pretend this had never happened, try to forget. Or I could see what Eleanor wanted to show me. Against my better judgment, I approached the closet and slid open the door. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just my clothes hanging neatly on the rod, shoes lined up below. But as I was about to close the door again, I noticed a slight discoloration on the back wall, near the floor. Kneeling, I examined the spot more closely. It wasn't discoloration, but a small seam in the wall, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. A panel of some kind. I pressed against it gently, and with a soft click, it swung inward, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I carefully extracted it. The cover bore no name, but when I opened to the first page, I saw flowing script that read, "The Private Diary of Eleanor Fleming, 1931. I should have left then, taken the journal to read someplace safe. But an urgency I couldn't explain compelled me to open to the final entry, dated 3 days before Eleanor's death. "Father discovered my letters to Thomas today," she had written. "His rage was terrible to behold. He has forbidden me from leaving the house and threatens to send me to Aunt Margaret in Boston if I do not end my engagement. But I will not yield. Thomas and I plan to elope this Saturday. By the time Father realizes I am gone, we will be married. I pray he will eventually forgive us, but even if he does not, a life with Thomas is worth any sacrifice." Eleanor never got her Saturday elopement. She died on Friday night. I closed the journal, a profound sadness settling over me. Had Josiah Fleming murdered his own daughter to prevent her from marrying his rival's son? And if so, why was Eleanor's spirit still here, nearly a century later? The answer came to me as I carefully placed the diary in my bag alongside the locket. Eleanor's death had been ruled natural causes. Her murder, if that's what it was, never investigated. Her killer never brought to justice. Her story had been silenced, her truth buried with her. Until now. That night, from the safety of Tara's apartment, I began reading Eleanor's diary from the beginning. It painted a picture of a bright, passionate young woman trapped in the gilded cage of her father's expectations. Her secret romance with Thomas Reynolds had been her one rebellion, her hope for escape. The final pages were heartbreaking in their optimism, knowing as I did how the story ended. Her excitement about the wedding dress being made in secret by Thomas's sister. Her plans for the small house they would live in, far from Maple Creek and her father's influence. 3 days after finding the diary, I brought it and the locket to Detective Morgan at the Maple Creek Police Department. She was understandably skeptical about investigating a possible murder from 1932 based on a diary and town gossip, but the pattern of deaths in the house and the near miss of the previous tenant convinced her to at least look into it. "I can't promise anything," she warned me, "but if there's a connection between these deaths, we should know about it." It took months, but eventually the investigation uncovered evidence that changed everything. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a small object buried in the garden behind what had been my bedroom, a glass vial containing traces of digitalis, a heart-stopping poison derived from foxglove. The timeline matched Eleanor's death, and while it couldn't be definitively linked to Josiah Fleming after all this time, it supported the theory that Eleanor had been murdered. More surprisingly, similar vials were found corresponding to where Marissa Green's bed would have been in the 1970s, suggesting a copycat killing inspired by local legends about Eleanor's death. The case made national news, bringing renewed attention to both women's stories. Eleanor's diary was published with permission from her remaining distant relatives, becoming an unexpected bestseller that chronicled not just her tragic end, but her vibrant life. As for me, I never returned to live in that house. Mrs. Abernathy sold it after the investigation, and the new owners had it thoroughly renovated, blessing it with rituals from several different spiritual traditions before moving in. They've reported no unusual occurrences, no footprints, no lockets, no shadow figures. I sometimes wonder if Eleanor has finally found peace, her story told, her truth acknowledged. I hope so. I hope she and Thomas somehow found each other in whatever lies beyond this life. I've moved to a modern apartment building across town. No history, no hidden compartments, no mysterious former tenants. Luna seems happier here, no longer staring at empty corners or bristling at unseen presences. But occasionally, in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, I catch a whiff of damp soil and metal. And sometimes, just before dawn, I think I see a flash of white at the corner of my vision. A dress, perhaps, or a bridal veil, fluttering as if in a gentle breeze, before vanishing like morning mist. I don't feel afraid when this happens. Instead, I whisper, "Rest well, Eleanor," and turn over to sleep peacefully until morning. Because here's what I've learned. Not all hauntings are malevolent. Sometimes a spirit lingers not to frighten, but because its story needs to be told. Sometimes being witnessed is all a ghost really wants. So if you ever find yourself frozen in your bed at night, aware of a presence you can't explain, ask yourself what story it might be trying to tell, and whether you might be the one meant to hear it. If you've experienced something similar, share your story in the comments. If this tale sent shivers down your spine, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are more stories waiting to be told, more mysteries hiding in plain sight. And next time, it could be your hometown, your house, your bedroom where the veil between worlds grows thin. Sleep well. Or try to, anyway. Story number 4. Hey there, fellow mystery lovers. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I want to thank you for joining me here in the darkness. If you're new here, you're in for a treat. And if you're returning, well, you know exactly what kind of journey we're about to embark on together. Tonight's story is one that was whispered to me by a park ranger with shaking hands and darting eyes. He made me promise never to reveal his name, but he never said I couldn't share what he told me. What you're about to hear happened in one of America's most beautiful national forests, a place where thousands go to reconnect with nature every year. But after this story, you might think twice about wandering too far from the trail. If you're listening in bed right now, maybe check that your doors are locked. And remember, sometimes the true terror isn't what's hiding in the darkness. It's what the darkness is hiding from. So get comfortable, dim those lights, and prepare yourself for the story of the man who disappeared without a trace in the forest. Our story begins now. The fluorescent lights of the Pine Ridge Ranger Station hummed overhead as Mark Calloway sipped his coffee and stared at the missing persons report on his desk. 5 days had passed since Thomas Wheeler, a 42-year-old software engineer from Seattle, had vanished in Whispering Pines National Forest. Mark ran his fingers through his salt and pepper hair, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening as he frowned at the photograph clipped to the folder. Thomas Wheeler smiled back at him, an ordinary man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, wearing a North Face jacket and standing proudly on what appeared to be a previous hiking trip. There was nothing remarkable about him, which made his disappearance all the more unsettling. "Another cup?" asked Diane, the station administrator, appearing at his desk with the coffee pot. A local who'd worked at the station for over 20 years, she knew the rhythms of this forest better than most. "No thanks." Mark shook his head. "I need to head out soon. Going back to the Wheeler campsite one more time." Diane's expression tightened. "Alone? It's getting late, Mark. The search and rescue team has moved on to the eastern quadrant. I have a feeling we missed something. Mark gathered his jacket. It doesn't make sense. Experienced hiker, good weather, well-marked trail. People don't just vanish into thin air. Sometimes they do. Diane's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Not the first time in these woods. Won't be the last. Mark chose to ignore her comment as he grabbed his keys. I'll radio if I find anything. The drive to the Wheeler campsite took 40 minutes along winding forest roads, the autumn sun hanging low in the sky and casting long shadows through the towering pines. The radio crackled with updates from the search team. Still nothing. 5 days was a critical threshold in missing persons cases. After that, the statistics became grim. Mark had worked as a ranger in Whispering Pines for 12 years, and in that time, he'd helped locate dozens of lost hikers. Most were found within the first 24 hours, disoriented but safe. A few had suffered injuries or exposure. Only 3 had been recovered deceased. But there were 2, now potentially 3 with Wheeler, who had simply vanished, leaving behind perfectly intact campsites, and no signs of struggle. No evidence of animal attacks, no indication of where they had gone. The first disappearance had happened shortly after Mark started working at Whispering Pines. Lisa Carrington, a 35-year-old teacher from Portland, had vanished from her campsite. Search teams found her camp chair positioned to face the sunset, a half-empty can of LaCroix beside it, her hiking boots neatly placed outside her tent. Then, 3 years later, James Moretti, a graduate student researching local fungi, disappeared from the North Ridge area. His research equipment was still set up, his specimen containers carefully labeled, his journal entries stopping mid-sentence. The search for Moretti had been extensive: helicopters, infrared cameras, expert trackers, and had yielded absolutely nothing. Both cases had eventually been classified as presumed fatal accidents, the files gathering dust in the county sheriff's archives. But Mark had never been satisfied with that explanation. The campsite was exactly as they'd found it 4 days ago, a small clearing just off the Aspen Trail, about 3 miles from the nearest access road. Thomas Wheeler's blue 2-person tent still staked perfectly to the ground, a small fire pit with the remains of his last meal, a camp chair facing the forest, his backpack still inside the tent with his wallet, phone, and additional supplies. Even his hiking boots were neatly placed at the entrance of the tent. That detail had always disturbed Mark the most. Who wanders into the wilderness without their boots? The search teams had combed the area repeatedly, using dogs, drones, thermal imaging. Nothing. It was as if Thomas Wheeler had simply stepped out of existence. Mark zipped his jacket against the autumn chill and began to methodically walk the perimeter of the campsite again. The forest was unusually quiet tonight. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the occasional whisper of wind through the pines and the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. "What happened to you, Thomas?" Mark murmured, kneeling to examine the ground near the fire pit. Nothing new. No footprints leading away from camp. No broken branches indicating someone had crashed through the underbrush. Just nothing. As Mark stood, something caught his eye. A faint glint among the fallen leaves about 20 feet from the campsite. He approached cautiously, pushing aside the colorful autumn foliage with his boot. A watch, a simple digital Timex with a worn leather band. Mark picked it up carefully, turning it over in his gloved hand. The face was cracked, and the time was frozen at 3:17. AM or PM, there was no way to tell. Mark frowned. The search teams had been thorough. How had they missed this? He pocketed the watch and made a mental note to check if it matched the description of anything Thomas had been wearing. As he straightened, Mark felt a peculiar sensation, like he was being observed. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he turned slowly, scanning the darkening forest around him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet woods. "Anyone there?" Nothing but silence answered him. Yet the feeling persisted. Mark had spent most of his adult life in these woods. He knew the difference between the normal awareness of nature and the distinct feeling of being watched. This was definitely the latter. He reached for his radio. "Base, this is Calloway. I'm at the Wheeler campsite. Found a watch that might be relevant. Anything from the search teams?" Static crackled for a moment before Diane's voice came through. "Nothing yet. They're making one more sweep before nightfall. Mark, you should head back soon. Weather report says fog rolling in tonight." "Copy that. I'll—" A twig snapped in the forest behind him. Mark spun around, hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. "Hello? Forest Service." The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen as the sun sank lower, casting the forest in a dim, bluish twilight. Mark stared into the gathering darkness, pulse quickening. Another snap, closer this time. "Identify yourself," Mark called, unclipping the bear spray. Could be a deer or a black bear, but something about the deliberate nature of the sound made him doubt it was wildlife. For a long moment, nothing happened. Mark stood frozen, straining to hear any movement over the sound of his own breathing. Then, footsteps, slow and measured, moving through the underbrush toward the campsite, but no figure emerged from the trees. "This is your final warning," Mark said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Identify yourself now." The footsteps stopped. Then, from somewhere in the darkening forest, came a voice, so faint it might have been the wind. "Mark." A chill ran down Mark's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He hadn't introduced himself. No one out here should know his name. "Who's there?" he demanded, backing slowly toward his vehicle while keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line. "Help me. I'm lost." The voice was clearer now, a man's voice, weak and trembling. "Please, don't leave me here." Mark hesitated. As a ranger, his duty was to help anyone in distress, but every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. "Step into the clearing where I can see you," Mark ordered, his hand tightening around the bear spray. A figure began to emerge from between the trees, indistinct in the fading light, moving with an odd, shuffling gait. Mark squinted, trying to make out details. Male, average height, wearing what appeared to be hiking clothes. As the figure moved closer, Mark felt a surge of hope. "Thomas? Thomas Wheeler?" The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, still partially obscured by shadow. "Help me," it repeated, voice cracking with emotion. "I've been lost for so long." "Stay there," Mark said, reaching for his flashlight with his free hand. "I'm coming to you." He took one step forward, then froze as his light beam illuminated the figure. It was a man in hiking clothes, jeans, flannel shirt, vest. But his appearance was wrong. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes were black voids, reflecting no light. Though he stood perfectly still, there seemed to be a subtle distortion around his edges, as if the very air was bending around him. This was not Thomas Wheeler. This was not anyone Mark recognized. And yet, "Mark Calloway," the figure said, his mouth moving oddly, out of sync with the words. "Ranger for 12 years, lives alone at 1437 Pinecrest Road, keeps the spare key under the ceramic frog." Ice flooded Mark's veins. "Who are you?" he whispered. The figure's head tilted at an impossible angle. "I am hungry," it said simply. Mark didn't hesitate. He turned and ran for his vehicle, heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he heard the rapid thud of footsteps in pursuit. He fumbled with his keys, wrenching open the driver's door and throwing himself inside. As he slammed the door shut and hit the lock button, he caught a glimpse of the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still now, watching. With shaking hands, Mark started the engine and threw the ranger vehicle into reverse, tires spinning on the forest floor as he backed away. In his headlights, the figure remained motionless, its face now expressionless, empty eyes fixed on Mark. Then it smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that seemed to split its face. Mark yanked the wheel around and sped down the forest road, gravel pinging against the undercarriage as he pushed the vehicle to its limits. His radio crackled to life. "Mark? Mark, come in." Diane's voice sounded concerned. "We lost your signal for a minute there." He grabbed the radio. "Diane, there's someone at the Wheeler campsite. Not Wheeler, someone else. Something else. I'm heading back now." "What? Mark, you're breaking up. Did you say you found someone?" "Call the sheriff," Mark insisted, eyes darting to his rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness behind him. "Tell him to send deputies to the campsite, now." Okay. Diane sounded confused, but responded to the urgency in his voice. "Are you all right?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Was he all right? His heart was still racing, and cold sweat soaked his shirt beneath his jacket. He couldn't shake the image of those empty eyes, that wrong smile. "I'm fine," he lied. "Just get the sheriff out there." The rest of the drive passed in a blur, Mark constantly checking his mirrors, half expecting to see the figure somehow pursuing him. By the time he reached the ranger station, night had fully fallen, and a light fog was beginning to roll in from the valley. Diane was waiting for him at the door, concern etched on her face. "Sheriff Collins is sending 2 deputies out there, but they won't arrive for at least 30 minutes. What happened, Mark? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark pushed past her into the station, making straight for the coffee pot. His hands were still shaking as he poured himself a cup. "Not a ghost," he said, voice low. "I don't know what I saw." He described the encounter to Diane, watching as her expression shifted from concern to outright fear. "You need to stay away from that place," she said when he'd finished. "All of you do. The search teams, the deputies, everyone." Mark frowned at her tone. "What do you know, Diane? This isn't the first time you've hinted at something strange in these woods." Diane glanced toward the windows, where fog was now pressing against the glass like pale fingers. "Sit down," she said finally. "There's something I should have told you years ago." As the fog thickened outside and the deputies radioed in to report finding nothing at the Wheeler campsite, Diane told Mark about the history of Whispering Pines that didn't appear in any tourist brochure. The indigenous people who had first inhabited the region had called it the place of hungry shadows and avoided it entirely. Early settlers had reported people vanishing without explanation. Every few decades, there would be a cluster of disappearances, 3 or 4 people over the course of a year, and then nothing for another generation. The Chinook people had legends about this forest, Diane explained, her voice taking on the quality of someone sharing forbidden knowledge. They believed certain parts of these woods existed in 2 places at once, our world and somewhere else, a hungry place that occasionally opened to claim travelers. She pulled out an old journal from her desk drawer. "My grandfather collected stories from tribal elders. One elder described how his great-grandmother's brother went hunting in these woods and returned changed. He looked the same, but his family knew immediately that whatever came back wasn't him. 2 days later, 3 children from their village disappeared." "What did they do?" Mark asked, unable to look away from Diane's haunted expression. "They drove a stake through its heart and burned the body. The children were never found." She closed the journal carefully. There are similar stories from the European settlers. The Patterson expedition of 1847 lost 4 men in these woods. One returned a week later, but his companions described him as hollow-eyed and wrong in his mannerisms. "My grandfather was a ranger here in the 1950s, Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty station. He documented at least 5 disappearances that were officially attributed to hiking accidents or animal attacks, but he knew better." "Knew what?" Mark asked, leaning forward. "That something lives in the deepest part of the forest. Something old. Something that hungers. She met Mark's eyes steadily. Something that can look like anyone it wants. Under normal circumstances, Mark would have dismissed such talk as local superstition, but after what he'd seen tonight... "The watch I found," he said suddenly, pulling it from his pocket. "Could it be Wheeler's?" Diane examined it, then shook her head. "This is an old model. Been discontinued for at least 20 years. And look at the band." Mark looked closer and felt a fresh chill. What he'd taken for normal wear and tear in the dim forest light was actually a dark, reddish-brown stain along the leather. "That's blood," Diane said quietly. "And I'll bet if you check the records, this watch belonged to someone who disappeared in these woods long before Thomas Wheeler ever set foot here." Mark carefully placed the watch on the desk between them. "So what do we do? How do we find Wheeler?" Diane's face was grim in the harsh fluorescent light. "We don't. If it's taken him, he's gone. All we can do is warn people away from that part of the forest until it's satisfied." "That's not acceptable," Mark said, standing abruptly. "I can't just write him off based on folk tales." "It's not just tales," Diane insisted. "Why do you think the search dogs couldn't track him? Why was there no trace at all? It doesn't just take their bodies, Mark. It takes everything. Their scent, their footprints, every trace they ever existed. Except what? Sometimes it leaves something behind. A personal item from a previous victim. Like a signature or a trophy. It's discarding to make room for a new one." She nodded at the watch. Mark paced the small office, mind racing. "I need to go back out there tomorrow. In daylight. With a team." "That would be a mistake," Diane warned. "It's active now. Hunting. You'd be putting more people at risk." "Then I'll go alone." Mark's jaw set stubbornly. "That's an even bigger mistake." Diane stood and gathered her coat. "But I know you well enough to know you won't listen. Just be careful. Don't go off the main trails. And Mark, if you see Thomas Wheeler out there, run, because it won't be him." After Diane left, Mark spent hours poring over old incident reports, searching for patterns in the previous disappearances. By the time he looked up, it was past midnight, and the fog outside had become so thick he could barely see the parking lot. He decided to sleep on the cot in the back room rather than drive home in these conditions. As he settled in for an uncomfortable night, his mind kept returning to the figure in the forest and its unnaturally wide smile. Sleep came fitfully, and with it, dreams. He was wandering through whispering pines, but the trees were wrong. Too tall, too twisted, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. Ahead of him walked Thomas Wheeler, always just out of reach. "Wait," Mark called in the dream. "I'm here to help you." Wheeler turned, but his face was blurred, indistinct. "Too late," he said in a voice that echoed strangely. "It's wearing me now." The dream shifted, and Mark found himself standing at the edge of a clearing he didn't recognize. In the center stood strange, pale figures. Humanoid, but wrong, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Between them lay what appeared to be clothing, a North Face jacket, jeans, hiking boots, Wheeler's belongings. One of the figures turned slowly toward him. It had no face, just smooth, blank skin where features should be. Yet somehow, Mark knew it was looking directly at him. "You're next," it said in Wheeler's voice. "We're hungry for you, Mark Calloway." Mark jolted awake at 3:17 a.m., sweat-soaked and disoriented. The ranger station was silent except for the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the building settling. He lay still, heart pounding, trying to shake off the nightmare. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. Tap, tap, tap. Mark froze, ears straining. The sound had come from the front of the station, probably just a branch against the window. Tap, tap, tap. More insistent this time.
Slowly, Mark sat up and reached for his flashlight. The station was remote enough that visitors at this hour were highly unusual. He moved quietly through the darkened building to the front office. The fog outside made it impossible to see anything beyond the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Right on the main door now. "Who's there?" Mark called, keeping his distance from the entrance. A long silence followed. Mark was beginning to think he'd imagined the sound when a voice came through the door, muffled but unmistakable. "Mark? It's me, Thomas Wheeler. Please, I'm so cold." Mark's blood turned to ice. He took an involuntary step backward. "The search teams are looking for you," he called, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Stay where you are and I'll radio them your location." A pause. Then, "No need for that. Just let me in. I'm so cold, Mark. I've been lost for days." Something about the voice was wrong. The cadence too measured, the tone too flat despite the pleading words. Mark reached for his radio. "This is Ranger Calloway at Pine Ridge Station. I need immediate backup. Possible emergency situation." He didn't know how else to describe it. Only static answered him. "The fog interferes with the signal," said the voice outside, now sounding almost amused. "No one can hear you, Mark. It's just you and me." "You're not Wheeler," Mark said, backing toward his office where his keys and weapon were stored. "No?" The voice changed, becoming deeper, raspier. "Then maybe you'll recognize this voice better." Ice flooded Mark's veins as he heard his father's voice, dead 5 years now, continue. "Son, please, I need your help." "Stop it," Mark whispered. The tapping came again, harder now, a deliberate rhythm against the glass door. Through the fog, Mark could just make out a dark silhouette, human-shaped but somehow wrong, the proportions slightly off. "Let me in, Mark," the thing outside said, cycling through voices now. Diane's, then the sheriff's, then Mark's own voice perfectly mimicked back to him. "I just want to talk. Don't you want to know what happened to Thomas Wheeler? Don't you want to know what's going to happen to you?" Mark backed into his office and grabbed his keys and service weapon. There was another exit through the back room, if he could just make it to his vehicle. A loud crack made him jump, the sound of breaking glass from the front entrance. No more time. Mark sprinted through the back room and out the emergency exit, the cold night air hitting him like a physical blow as he emerged into the thick fog. His vehicle was just 10 yards away, a dark shape in the swirling mist. Behind him, he heard the station door slam open, followed by the sound of something moving, not footsteps, but a strange, sliding, dragging noise that raised the hair on his arms. Mark ran for his vehicle, keys clutched tightly in his shaking hand. The fog seemed to resist him, curling around his legs like grasping tendrils, slowing his progress. 3 yards from his vehicle, Mark risked a glance over his shoulder. The figure stood at the emergency exit, still shrouded in fog but visible enough that Mark could see its form shifting. One moment the approximate shape of Thomas Wheeler, the next something taller, thinner, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. "You can't escape me, Mark Calloway," it said in that terrible multi-layered voice. "No one escapes the hungry shadow." Mark reached his vehicle and yanked the door open, throwing himself inside and slamming it shut just as something heavy thudded against the driver's side window. He started the engine with trembling hands, not daring to look at what pressed against the glass. The vehicle roared to life, and Mark floored the accelerator, fishtailing out of the parking lot and onto the forest road. In his rearview mirror, he could see nothing but fog, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the ranger station and whatever stood watching from its perimeter. He drove blindly through the night, fog limiting visibility to just a few feet ahead, taking turns purely from memory of the familiar roads. His mind raced faster than his vehicle. What was that thing? How many victims had it claimed over the years? And why had it set its sights on him? The road ahead emerged from the fog just in time for Mark to see the fallen tree blocking his path. He slammed on the brakes, tires skidding on the damp asphalt as the vehicle slid toward the massive trunk. The impact was jarring.
Not enough to deploy the airbags, but enough to snap Mark's head forward and back, momentarily stunning him. As his vision cleared, he became aware of a figure standing in the road ahead, just beyond the fallen tree. Thomas Wheeler, or something wearing his appearance, stood perfectly still, watching the vehicle with an unnatural stillness. Even at this distance, Mark could see that its eyes reflected no light. "No," Mark whispered, fumbling with his seatbelt. The vehicle was damaged, but might still run. He had to get out of here. As he shifted into reverse, the figure began to walk toward him, a smooth gliding movement that seemed to cover more ground than it should with each step. The engine sputtered as Mark tried to accelerate backward. Through the fog in his rearview mirror, he could make out more shapes, indistinct figures standing among the trees, watching. The engine died completely as the figure reached the hood of his vehicle. It placed one hand on the metal, and Mark watched in horror as the paint beneath its palm began to bubble and peel. "What do you want?" Mark shouted through the windshield, desperation overcoming fear. The thing wearing Thomas Wheeler's face smiled, that same terrible, too wide smile, and spoke, its voice somehow inside the vehicle with him, whispering directly into his ear. "Everything." That was the last time anyone saw Ranger Mark Calloway. His damaged vehicle was found the next morning by a road crew clearing a fallen tree. The driver's door was open, the seatbelt unbuckled. There were no signs of blood, no evidence of a struggle. Just empty forest and dissipating fog. The official report states that Ranger Calloway likely survived the minor collision and wandered into the forest, possibly disoriented from the impact. Despite extensive searches, his body was never recovered. Thomas Wheeler remains officially classified as a missing person, presumed deceased. 2 weeks after Mark's disappearance, a hiker on the Aspen Trail found a Forest Service badge on the ground near Campsite 7, the same site where Thomas Wheeler had vanished. The badge belonged to Mark Calloway. Next to it was a digital Timex watch with a worn leather strap. The face was intact, the time reading 3:17. The hiker who found these items reported an unusual experience just before discovering them, a feeling of being watched, followed by whispers that seemed to come from between the trees. She left the forest immediately afterward and hasn't returned since. Diane, the station administrator, retired the following month and moved out of state. Before leaving, she had the Wheeler campsite officially closed, citing environmental concerns. No one has camped there since. Whispering Pines National Forest remains a popular destination for hikers, campers, and nature enthusiasts from across the country. Most visit without incident, enjoying the breathtaking scenery and peaceful trails. But locals know to be off the trails before dusk. They know not to hike alone, and they know that if they ever encounter a familiar face deep in the woods, someone who shouldn't be there, someone whose eyes don't quite reflect the light correctly, they should run. Because sometimes the things that disappear into the forest aren't gone at all. So there you have it, folks. The story of the man who disappeared without a trace in the forest. Or should I say, men. Makes you wonder what else might be lurking in America's wilderness, doesn't it? What ancient things might be watching from just beyond the tree line, wearing familiar faces to lure us deeper into their domain. If this story kept you up tonight instead of lulling you to sleep, well, maybe that's for the best. Sometimes staying awake is safer than closing your eyes. And if you're planning a camping trip anytime soon, remember, stay on the marked trails, never hike alone. And if you ever hear someone calling your name from the darkness, someone who knows details they shouldn't, don't answer, don't follow, and whatever you do, don't invite them in. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, hit that subscribe button right now to join our growing community of night owls and fear seekers. Drop a comment below sharing your own unexplained forest experiences. I read every single one, and if this story gave you chills, smash that like button and share with a friend who needs to think twice before their next hiking trip. Until next time, sleep tight. And remember, that tapping at your window? It's probably just the wind. Probably.
Now, it's up to you. Will you rise and check the window? Will you pull back the curtain and face what waits beyond the glass? Or will you stay where you are, letting the shadows stretch longer, letting your heart race faster as you lie there, caught in the thrill of not knowing? Was it the wind or something else, waiting just outside?